हेलो दोस्तों, स्वागत है आप सभी का हमारे चैनल इग्नो सेंटर पर। तो दोस्तों, आज का जो टॉपिक है वह हमारा मदर इन कैथीड्रल का समरी रहेगा और ये समरी एक ब्रीफ डिस्कशन रहेगा जो कि आप सभी को ये जो स्टोरी है यानी जो ड्रामा है वो आपको एकदम पूरा क्लियर एंड क्रिस्टल क्लियर हो जाएगा और इस पर हम कैरेक्टर और समरी डील करेंगे। तो दोस्तों, बढ़ते हैं हमारी समरी की ओर। मदर इन कैथीड्रल। Eliot wrote his play for an audience expected to know the historical story of Thomas Beckett and King Henry II. For that reason, a brief review of that story contained in the About Thomas Beckett and King Henry II section of the note will greatly aid comprehension of this summary. Mother in Cathedral opened in the Archbishop Hall on December 2nd, 1170. A chorus comprising women of Canterbury has gathered at the cathedral with some premonition of a traveler event to come. In a long speech, they reflect on how their lives are defined by suffering and reflected on their Archbishop Thomas Becket. He has been in exile from England for 7 years after a terrible clash with King Henry II. The women worry that his return could make their life more difficult by angering the king. Three priests enter the hall and also lament Thomas' absence and debate the ramification of his potential return. A herald alive, bringing news that Thomas has indeed returned to England and will soon arrive in Canterbury. The herd quests their hopes, and Thomas' return indicates reconciliation with Henry and confess his own concern that violence is soon to follow the Archbishop's return. Once the heralds leave, the priests reflect on Thomas' time as Chancellor of England when he served as secular administrator under Henry. The chorus, listening to the priest discuss the matter, confess their disappointment and his return, which they believe will bring them more suffering. They admit their lives are hard but predictable, and they would rather persist in quiet than live through the turmoil of new political and spiritual upheaval. 180. The second priest insults them and insists they fake happiness to welcome Thomas. However, Thomas enters during this exchange and stresses that the priest is mistaken to cheat them. Since they have some sense of the difficulty that awaits them, he stresses that all should submit to patience, since none can truly know God's plans or intention. A series of tempers enter one by one, each attempting to compromise Thomas' eternity. The first temper reminds Thomas of the libertine ways of his youth and tempts him to relinquish his responsibilities in favor of a more carefree life. The second temper suggests Thomas reclaim the title of Chancellor, since he could do more good for the poor, though a powerful political process political post that he could as a religious figure. The third temper possessed a progressive form of government in which a ruler and barons worked together as a coalition. In fact, he offered Thomas a chance to rule and break new ground in government. Thomas easily rejected all three tempers. After all, they are form of tempertation that he has already rejected in his life. A fourth temper enter and suggests the idea of martyrdom, which he notes would give Thomas the great dominion over his enemy. He would remember throughout the age if he allowed himself to die for the church, while his enemy would be judged and then forgotten by time. Thomas is sickened by this temptation, since it is something he has often entertained in his private moment. He recognized that to die for pride, which is the wrong reason, would compromise the integrity of a martyrdom. So he must overcome that impulse if death is to have meaning. While he considered the dilemma, all of the character thus far mentioned, except the Herald, give a long address considering the uncertainty of life. When they finish, Thomas announced that his way is clear. He will not seek martyrdom from fame, but instead will submit to God's will. He has accepted his faith. Part 1 ends here. Between Part 1 and Part 2, Thomas Beckett preaches a sermon in an interlude, in which he restates the lesson he learned at the end of Part 1. The interlude is set in the Cathedral on Christmas morning, 1770. In the sermon, Thomas considers the misery of Christianity, which both mourns and celebrates the fact of Christ's death. Christians mourn the world that made it necessary, while celebrating the sacrifice that enables others to transcend that world. He suggests that the appreciation of Martins is a smaller version of that misery, and define the true martyrs as he who has become the instrument of God, who has lost his will in the will of God, not lost it but found it, for he has found freedom in his submission to God. 199. He closed his sermon by admitting he might not preach to congregation again. The first scene of Part 2 is set in the Archbishop Hall on December 29, 1170. The terrified courts begin with an ominous address, after which four Buddhist knights enter. They insist they are there on Henry business from France and demand an audience with Thomas, despite attempts by the priest to distract them. Thomas arrives and is immediately insulted and chided by the knight for what they perceive as disloyalty towards Henry and misuse of the Archbishop's position to incite opposition to England. Thomas denies their interpretation of events but also reveals a sincerity and readiness to die when necessary. The knight attempt to attack him but are interpreted by the priest. A more specific political argument followed during which Thomas continued to deny their claims and insult them as overly concerned with petty political matter. Angry, the knight threatened the priest with death if they let Beckett escape, and then the knight leave. The chorus give a brutal, evocative speech, and Thomas comfort them. He acknowledged that by bearing necessary witness to the ritual of his death, their lives will grow more difficult. But he maintained that they can find comfort in recollection on having been here this fateful day. As the night approached again, the priest begged Thomas to flee, but he refused. The knight forced him from the hall and into the cathedral against his protestation. As the scene changed, the women of the chorus still themselves for the death soon to follow. The priest barred the door, which the knight then began to besiege. The priest's argument do not convince Thomas, who accused them of thinking too much of cause and effect rather than accepting God's plan. Finally, the priest opened the door and the knight drunkenly entered. They demand Thomas lift all the excommunication he has put upon English ruler. He refuses and they murder him. While Thomas is being murdered, the chorus give a long, desperate address lamenting the life they will now have to lead in the shadow of Thomas' martyrdom. After the murder is done, the four knights address the audience directly. They wish to explain themselves and defend their action. The first knight admits he has no facility for argument and so act as a MC to introduce the other knight. The second knight says he understands how the audience and history will hate them, but begs the audience to realize the knight were disinterested in the murder. They were merely following orders that were necessary for the good of England. 216. The third knight presents a long, complex argument suggesting that Beckett was guilty of betraying the English people and hence was killed justly. The fourth knight suggests that Beckett willed his own death by pursuing martyrdom for the sake of pride and hence is guilty of suicide, making the knight not guilty of murder. Once the knights leave, the priests lament Thomas' death and worry about what the world will become. The chorus gives the final speech, revealing that They have accepted the duties as Christians. They acknowledge that living up to a sacrifice Thomas made it difficult, but that they will be spiritually richer for undertaking this challenge, and they began mercy and forgiveness from Thomas and God. So, friend, our summary was ended here, and it was a nice summary. If you listen on Hindi, it will helpful for you too. For the Hindi video, you can visit one of the YouTubers who make every video on Hindi as a summary, and it was also available on his channel. So I only make here notes on summary, and which was not given by most of the YouTubers, and which was more important than you all to just recognize the summary. So hope you all understand the summary, and now we begin with our characters. So character number 1, Thomas. Thomas Beckett is the Archbishop of Canterbury and former Chancellor of England. Historically, he stood up against Henry to demand that church subsume its authority to Henry secular power and ultimately die for the cause. In the play, he is represented as an overly proud and sanctimonious man who nevertheless transcends his weakness to accept martyrdom as a God will. Chorus. The chorus of murder in Cathedral compromise the women of Canterbury, poor, common, and plain. These women have lived a difficult but manageable life since Thomas was sent into exile 7 years before the play began. Though they are Catholic and respect the Archbishop, they are also worried that his return will bring them a new level of spiritual burden. The play examines the way they come to accept their spiritual responsibility, though the example of Thomas martyrdom. Herod, a messenger who brings word that Thomas Becket has returned to England and will soon arrive in Canterbury. He has a premonition that Thomas' return visits violence. First priest, a nameless priest of Canterbury, characterized by his excessive mournfulness and worries. He continually sees the situation of Beckett's return as one that can bring trouble for his people and their country. Second priest, a nameless priest of Canterbury, characterized by his pragmatism. He examined Beckett's return based on its political ramifications and notes how Becket clashed with Henry reflect issue of land ownership and power rather than spiritual dominion. Third priest, a nameless priest of Canterbury, characterized by his patient, whereas the other priests worry about how Becket will return will change their lives. The third priest suggests that as no human can understand the way the universe works, so should they remain patient and allow God to work His will upon the world. First temper. The first man to tempt Thomas identified himself as Old Tom. He is a friend from Beckett early Cavalry days, and he tempts Thomas with the possibility of relinquishing his responsibilities in favor of a more libertine lifestyle. Second temper. The second man to tempt Thomas identifies him as a politically ally from Thomas days as Chancellor. He tempts Thomas to resume his role as Chancellor, arguing that Thomas could do more good for the poor through secular power than he ever could as priest. Third temper. Thomas does not know the third temper, who identify himself a simple Barton. He tempts Thomas with the possibility of ruling the country via a coalition that would split control between the nomination ruler and the patron. Fourth temper. The fourth temper is unexpected. Using the subtle argument, he tempts Thomas with the possibility of committing martyrdom for the sake of his reputation and glory. He tempts, his temptation is powerful because it touches on something Thomas has wished is in his private movement. By denying this temptation, Thomas prepared himself to accept martyrdom for the right reason. First night. Though none of the four nights is particularly individualized before Beckett murder, the first night gave him name as Renignald Fitz hours after when he addressed the audience. He claims he is not a man of eloquence and so mostly serve as narrator during the night speech. Second night. Though none of the four nights is particularly individualized before Beckett murder, the second night is introduced as William D. Tricky. Afterwards, he presents as an emotional argument asking for pity on the ground that though the knight committed the murder, they were disinterested and merely did what was necessary for English people as ordered by the king. Third night. Though none of four nights is particularly individualized before Beckett's murder, the third night is introduced as Hugh de Morville after he presents a long detailed argument that Becket was guilty of great offence against the English people and hence was it legal to murder him. Fourth night. Though none of the fourth night is particularly individualized before Becket murder, the fourth night is introduced as Richard Brito after he presents the most subtle argument claiming that Becket essentially commits suicide by facilitating his murder and hence the knights are innocent of the crime. Henry King Henry II, though not a speaking character in the play, it is a large influence on the action. Historically, he was an impetuous king who wanted to subsume the various factions of English power under the crown. The most continuous of this was the church led in England by Thomas Becket. The knight arrived in his name and he is cited frequently by those in the play who try to understand Beckett's past and character. Pope. Though not a speaking character in the play, Pope Alexander figures prominently historically. He was protecting Thomas Becket at the time of this play action, allowing the archbishop to announced excommunication upon the English church. His protection is one of the many barriers between Thomas and Henry, and it gave Thomas a defense against the knight. So, friend, till here our summary was ended, and hope you all understand the character and the detailed summary, and you also get the notes of the detailed summary, so it was more helpful for you all. And be with us for more updates in the future, and press a bell icon so that you never miss an update. Thank you.